Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about the critical role of secure relationships in stable environments for student growth and learning. I'm Marjorie Botari. I'm the Vice President of Academics and Learning Design here at Hegarty, and I am so excited to have Kylie Burke with us today. Kylie is a former teacher, administrator, curriculum, and assessment creator, and is currently the CEO of Hegarty. We also have Dr. Diane King Shaw, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and is currently the clinical director of the Laurie Center School. As I said, I'm so excited to have you both with us today. We're really excited to just have a conversation that is so critical when we think about developing stable relationships and environments for students. But Kylie, before we jump in, I would love for you to just start us off with an opening exercise.
Yeah, so this is just a little bit of thinking on your own to help ground the conversation. If you can take a moment and think about a teacher, an educator, a mentor who has been in your life at some point. It could be from your childhood, it could be from your college years, but someone who had a profound impact on you besides your family. So, somebody in that teacher caregiver role. What was it about that relationship? What was it about that person that was so impactful for you? What did they do that had that lasting memory, left that mark on you? So many of us, particularly those of us who've chosen to go into education, have someone like that from our past. I always love when you hear celebrities making like their Oscar
Mm.
speeches and they thank a teacher from
Yes.
second grade. Or I always love how Oprah attributed so much of her success to her teachers. I know that for the 3 of us, we have those
Oh
experiences
god,
that,
no.
we certainly had in our past with teachers, and that really drew us into education. For me, my mother got sick when I was very young, and she died when I was 9, so my early childhood teachers were my constant, and they were the people who brushed my hair for me, and I think about one particular teacher. She was my 1st grade teacher. Her name was Mrs. Holt. Now, as an adult looking back, I can see her as the human being she was, when I was little. It's like she was this larger than life personality. She could not have been 5 feet tall. She was a very small woman. But she gave the best hugs. And I am almost 50 years
Um,
old, and I can still
uh,
feel what her hugs felt like. And she would just scoop you up in these arms that felt so safe and so caring and so protective. And she did it long after, like, hugs were, had started to not get cool in 4th and 5th grade. Like, you didn't really want hugs from your teacher. But I can remember, like, her doing it, kids squealing. But gosh, now knowing what I know about the importance of relationship, about that gentle touch, she knew that I wasn't getting hugs from a mama at home. And so
uh,
she did that for me. And like that is a memory that I carry with me always. And I know so many of you have memories like that too.
Thank you so much for sharing that because I'm a little bit teary eyed right here, but just thinking about the importance of what you're speaking on, Kylie, right? Is this awareness that the teacher had of what you needed? And I think so often in education, we get stuck on these instructional strategies and we need to do this and we need to do this. And we forget to just take a step back and recognize that learning happens in relationships. Right? If we are not developing these secure relationships, if our students don't have the stable environment that we can provide for them, right? They're not going to necessarily feel safe enough to learn, especially when we think about pieces that can be really hard. Reading is hard for a
Yeah.
lot of children, right? We know that. We look at, what as a nation, how many students struggle to become readers. That is something that is challenging. But in order for us to truly create an environment for learning, we need to recognize that really that that learning happens with relationships. So, Kylie, I
Yes.
always love, and I have shared multiple times when you talk about what happens to the brain, right? Because this isn't just touchy-feely. This is science. What happens to our brain or a child's brain if they are entering our classroom and they are already feeling dysregulated or unsafe?
Yes, and, we know that that's happening more and more
Mm.
these days. We're seeing the impact of dysregulation in our classrooms. And for those of you who've heard Marjorie and Diane talk about this in the past, I'll make sure I keep this super brief. But it's really important to ground ourselves in this is a physiological process. This isn't people choosing to be dysregulated, i.e., choosing to act in negative ways, right? This is a physiological process. Something is happening in our brains and bodies that we don't have control over, and particularly children don't have control over. We have to think about how new they are, how
Oh my
close
god.
they still are to their physiological process. So, I Marjorie had the perfect example yesterday. I was out on a trail here in San Diego, and I saw a gigantic rattlesnake. I took a picture of it. I sent it to Marjorie and some other people on the team, but it was this massive 4-foot rattlesnake. I think it had probably just eaten a rabbit or something. It was really fat, this giant rattlesnake. Um, and so my stress response was immediately activated. I didn't choose to be stressed in that moment. That just happened in my body.
You
So, what happened? First, my amygdala, that's the brain's fear center, sounded the alarm. That triggers your fight, flight, or freeze response, right? So, see the snake, I'm immediately in fight, flight, or freeze. That response releases powerful stress hormones that prepare me to either have to fight that rattlesnake, no thank you, or to quickly run away from it, right? Like those are really my choices. Adrenaline causes my heart to beat faster, stronger. My blood pressure rises as noradrenaline is released. My body's prepared for action. What I don't want to do in that moment is take a lot of time to stop and consider the snake, think about my feelings about the snake, get lost in my thoughts, right? Like
it
there's a
did.
rattlesnake in front of me. I have to react. So my fear center temporarily shuts down the thinking part of my brain, the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain responsible for problem solving, decision making, judgment, emotional regulation. So at the same time that my brain is sending these stress hormones, shutting down the prefrontal cortex, it's also releasing long term stress hormones. It's cortisol. I'm sure you've all heard about it. Everybody's talking about cortisol these days. But cortisol essentially helps prime you in case you need to keep fighting. So it's do you need to adapt to an environment where now you're constantly surrounded by rattlesnakes and this fight is going to go on for a long time? Cortisol prepares our bodies for that. Some of the effects of cortisol are similar to adrenaline, raises blood pressure, raises your blood sugar. It interrupts emotional regulation. It inhibits your ability to think clearly. It really messes up your sleep cycle. So when you're stressed out, we all know we don't get good sleep. That's your
No.
cortisol. We can thank it for that. It also causes your body to crave high sugar, high fat foods. That's so we have enough energy on board. So again, like stress eating, that's a real thing. It really does exist. And another incredible thing that our bodies do is that it activates our immune system. So all in the blink of an eye, all of this chemical process is happening. And our immune system gets activated so that if we get hurt, we're already prepared. Our bodies are prepared to bring inflammation to help protect us, to help heal us. And
Mhm.
now this is amazing. It's awesome. It's incredible. Our bodies can do these things. A healthy stress response has kept humans alive for
Mhm.
since the beginning of time. It's told me to get away from that snake fast,
Yes.
and I did. And once I was away from that snake, my healthy stress response, then I can come back into a regulated state. Now, the problem is when stress happens too frequently. So, when you're dealing with chronic stress or a stressor is too intense, your body can lose the ability to shut that process down. So, instead of a snake, if it's violence in my community, that's something I can't escape. If it's a scary home environment, that's an ever present threat. If it's every morning is a stressful morning in my house with the adults being at an 8 or a 9 or a 10 in stress level, that's chronic stress. And we've all seen children walking into our classrooms who
Uh-huh.
are coming in stress response mode already. They're coming in dysregulated. And we know this because we're seeing it in their behaviors, right? This is particularly true since the pandemic. So, in our brains and bodies, when we're exposed to repeated stressors, this is particularly true for children. They're the most vulnerable. When they're repeatedly exposed to stress, it causes changes, physiological changes in their brains and bodies. So when that amygdala gets repeatedly triggered, it can do two things. It can have an exaggerated response to a stimulus. So overreacting, treating everything like it's a threat, right? Everything gets
Mm.
treated like a rattlesnake. It can send false alarms. It can get confused about what is a threat and what is literally nothing at all. So you can have this outsized response. That's the make a mountain out of a molehill
Sure.
situation. Um, or you can perceive threats where there literally are none at all. That's the amygdala overreacting. In the locus coeruleus, it's another part of your brain, that can cause anxiety, arousal, aggression. It interrupts a sleep wake cycle. So if children aren't sleeping well, we know we see that stress showing up in our classroom. In the prefrontal cortex, remember that's the part responsible for thinking and impulse control and making decisions. Our body literally shuts that down when we're stressed. So that leads to an inability to concentrate and solve problems. It leads to impulsive behaviors and aggression. In the hippocampus, it causes dysregulation so that you struggle to make short term and long term memories. You need to be able to make memories to learn anything at all. There's so much happening in the brain and body, Marjorie. I totally was a runaway train on that explanation. But I think it's really important for us to remember all of this physiological process taking place during stress,
Thank you.
that our bodies activating and shutting down certain parts of the brain, deliberately strengthening some neural pathways while it's weakening others. So if you think about the tremendous impact that has on young children while their brains and bodies are still developing, when the very architecture of their brains is being built, those neural pathways that tell them to be on high alert, to be ready for a fight, to be hyper vigilant, to be ready to shut down. Those are the neural pathways being strengthened. And the ones related to impulse control and problem solving and emotional regulation, those are weakening. Right? Children's stress response, when they are in that mode, they're not in learning mode. And that's this overwhelming report that we're getting from teachers, that they're seeing more and more of this dysregulation in their classroom.
Yes. I think, gosh, I just could listen to you all day. And I think about students that I've had in the past. And I think about, teachers that I'm friends with now that are having these conversations over and over and over again. And I think one of the things that's just so important is sometimes, and again, I can think back to being in the classroom, right? You just get caught up in the go,
Yeah.
go, go and the this and we need to do this and we need to do this. And that child, they're not, they're defiant. Or that child
Mhm.
just refuses to take risks. That child just shuts down when something is hard.
Yeah.
And we just kind of label that as like that's something going on with that kiddo and not recognizing all of the pieces that you just talked about, right? And sometimes we think, well, it's not that big of a deal. Why are they making such a big deal about it? And then
Yeah.
you just told us exactly why, right? And unfortunately, we don't talk about this enough in education. We don't talk about it enough in undergrad. There's plenty we don't talk about.
Mm.
But even when we go back to graduate school, we're not talking about this. And oh
Yeah.
my goodness, like, why are
Yes.
we not talking about this? Because again, nothing else is going to move forward, right? If we can't
No.
develop this safe environment for our children to learn, if we can't recognize this is not a behavior issue, right? You are explaining
Yes.
this is a nervous system issue. This is something that we have to be able to support with. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, Marjorie, I think that there are probably plenty of people who might be watching this going, gee, why is a literacy company talking about circulation, spending so much time on this topic? And it really does come back to what you just said. Like, these aren't behavior issues. This is a nervous system issue. If we can reframe it in that way, then we can help children learn. Like, at Haggerty, we want all children
Yeah.
to be literate. We believe in the power of literacy as, this game-changing, lifelong skill that allows people to thrive and grow. We want so much for children to love a good book, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Like you.
and learning to read requires a regulated brain and body. It requires children to be in a regulated state. And so that's why, today having this conversation about relationship is so important because it's
Yeah.
only when children have supportive, strong, loving relationships, ones that are built on, responsive and intentional teaching, that they can learn to successfully regulate their emotions and behaviors, that they can build resilience, right? Resilience is built within the context of relationships. And research has shown us that the most important protective factor for children who are dysregulated, right? And for children who've experienced hardship or trauma in their lives, they can be chronically dysregulated. But the most important protective factor for them in helping them regulate and helping them to buffer against those negative impacts of early adversity is the presence of a caring, nurturing relationship with a trusted adult. And just like
Mhm.
Mrs. Holt was my person who did that for me, I was so fortunate and had many wonderful teachers in my life who continued to do that for me over the years. But those women did that for me and protected
Mhm.
me. And, I think in that same way, we get to be that presence for the children in our classrooms now.
I love that you said that because I think, going back again to where I started teaching, right? Like, I started teaching in, a high need area, right? Where we had a lot of students that were living in poverty, that had a lot of trauma. And oftentimes you hear and teachers get burnt out, educators get burnt out. You kind of see the cycle and you feel almost like you have no control over it. Or, oh, well, this is what home life is like. We
Mm.
have the power as educators to be that adult, right? We can make a change. And again, yes, we can make a change with literacy. We can make a change. But before all of that starts, we make the change by having that relationship, by being that person that can allow a child to feel safe, to create stability. And I think that's so important because, gosh, don't we have the best job in the world, right? Like, if we have the opportunity, it's so hard, but it's so amazing to have this opportunity to make this impact on children's lives. But in order to do that, we have to think about where we're at with our regulation, right?
Mm.
We have to think about adults and what that looks like for us. And I'm thinking, Kylie, as you talked about, especially now since the pandemic, just so many needs that we see in
Yeah.
children, but also for educators. And, I was just talking to a friend who's a building administrator who was just saying, she has just teachers coming into her office and just breaking down and just crying, right?
Mhm.
Because they feel the weight of the world on them, really, right? And so if we're going to be that for these students, if we're going to ensure that they have these secure relationships, these stable environments, and we need to be taking care of ourselves. We need to identify how we're, you know, feeling and recognize these triggers or these emotions. So, Diane, I would love for you to kind of dig in a little bit more about that educator regulation and why why does that matter so much as we're talking about creating these environments for children?
Sure. So I love how you mentioned self care. And I think the challenge is a lot of times people think of self care as selfish. I'm doing these things for
Mm,
me, but I have so many other people I could be doing things for. And educators, especially, are people who care about and want to take care of others. So we have to shift how we think about self care to start. By doing self care, you actually are taking care of others. And the reason why that is it starts with co regulation. If you think of
yes.
really young children, they don't have the ability to regulate themselves. They need you to keep them warm or cool them off or give them food or clean them up. They can't do that on their own. They need you to do it for them. And even as kids get older, they don't fully understand their feelings or what to do with their feelings.
Yes.
They need you to be with them, talking through what it is they're feeling, how they're showing it in their body, giving them the language to use to share their experience. And so the co regulation starts there with what are you doing in that moment to help calm their stress system and bring that thinking brain back online. Now, I love that the pandemic was mentioned because this is where we're seeing even more kids of older ages that really seem to be lacking regulation skills. They didn't have the opportunity to socialize and learn some of those skills. So, in a lot of ways, you're operating with kids who are old enough to know how to do it, but didn't have a chance to learn it. And so they're going to start by learning it from you. And they're going to start by looking at you and seeing how you handle your own stress, even if that's coming from them. So it's not just saying what they should do. They're going to look and see, okay, my teacher recommended I do this type of deep breathing. Do I see her ever doing it? Do I see us ever
Mm.
doing it together? So, in the beginning, as we're trying to help students learn how to use these regulation skills, we need to do it with them, that co-regulation. We need to
Mhm.
do it together before they can start to do it independently. And even though you may have some students in your classroom that are regulated, chances are there's something stressful, even if it's only a little bit, about school for everybody, whether it's social anxiety, whether it's I didn't get what I wanted for lunch that day, or whether it's the trauma that Kylie was talking about that's really more intense and coming with a lot of stress. So even taking a moment to do some of those activities with your whole classroom can really help stabilize everyone, including yourself, because you're using those strategies that are going to calm your own stress system. So you're coming into the situation being able to have your thinking brain ready to figure out how you're going to structure your classroom and your day to set the stage for kids to be available for learning. So I think it's really important to remember that that thinking part of your brain isn't just about logic, it's also about memory. All right. So if kids are stressed out and you're asking them to remember something you taught them the previous day, they're not going to be able to access that unless you have them in a calm, stable place. So it really starts with you as the teacher to be able to bring that to the table for students.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful of just again, it's what we've learned, right? That modeling. And if we're asking students to use these regulation strategies, but we're not using them, we're not modeling that behavior. Just in the same way that co-regulation can occur, we know that research shows that stress is biologically
Mm.
contagious too. So as we think about a classroom, what does that look like? Again, I can think about my own experiences in moments of, feeling a certain stress and in a classroom and even with my own children. Right? So, but as we think about the classroom setting, can you explain a little bit more what that means when we think about what that looks like in a classroom?
Absolutely. And I'm sure that everybody who is watching has that day when there were five different
Right.
crises happening with different
Right.
students at the same time. And so the way that starts is someone is bringing stress to the table. Someone is coming into the classroom in a dysregulated state. Whether that's the teacher, we had something happening in our own lives and we're coming in stressed, or whether it's a
Mhm.
student that had a really rough morning, that heard parents arguing, that missed their bus and had to be driven to school by an angry parent. Whatever that reason is, they're coming in dysregulated. And The same way we can create co-regulation, we can also create co-dysregulation by how we
Mhm.
feed off each other. So, for example, if there is a child who's stressed and we don't pick up on those cues, now they're engaging in behaviors that are disrupting our class. They're getting in the way of what we're trying to learn. Now we're starting to feel stressed. So maybe we respond in a way that's not ideal. Maybe we raise our voice. Maybe there's even
Mm.
just a tiny crease in the corner of our eye or a tiny little frown that's only there for a second. But kids are really attuned to that,
Mhm.
especially kids that are experiencing chronic stress, and even more so kids who've experienced trauma. Kids who've experienced trauma are hypervigilant. They're always looking for any, even the tiniest cues that something dangerous might be happening. So even though you might have great control of your face and rein it in really fast, if they see that one moment of stress, now you have another student in the classroom who's dysregulated. So you're dealing with the first student who came in, you're feeling stressed. Now another student is worried about what's happening over here. Is something dangerous going to
Right.
happen? Am I in danger? Is this classroom safe? And again, is looking to you to see how you handle that situation. So it can just keep cycling as more and more kids get involved and feel that stress. It raises your stress level, making you more likely to give off cues that you're experiencing stress and leading more students to feel stress. So it's kind of a cycle that each one leads to
Yes.
another and continues to build up. But if we have that regulation and self care practices in place, we can break that cycle. We can have that moment where we say, okay, hang on. This is really difficult for everybody. Let's all take a moment and do some deep breathing together. Or let's take a movement break, whatever that is that
Mhm.
works best for your classroom. And just by doing that, you're interrupting that cycle because you may not be able to get everybody back to baseline and get their thinking brain operational, but you're at least going to stop that cycle from escalating for your students.
I love that, and you're modeling it, right? And you're naming it. So I think that's something that's just listening to you, that kind of stood out to me as well. I think as educators, sometimes we feel like we have to, just, "Oh, hold it together," right? Like, "I'm stressed, but I'm just going to keep teaching, and I have to hold it together." But what you just said is we have students that are picking up on that, right? They're reading us, they're searching for that, they're identifying it, and then that cycle starts. But we can name it, we can model it, we can be, go the co-regulation. Let I'm feeling stressed right now. Oh my goodness, look at the time. I'm supposed to have this done. Now I'm going to take a few breaths. Let's take some breaths together. So I think it's so important that we name this, we honor it, we talk about that this is a part of the classroom. It should always
Yes.
be a part of the classroom. And it's not oh, when we have time, or oh, this is nice to have, or this is something separate. It is a part of our living and breathing day, of every component of our day. And so we've talked a lot about what this looks like when students are dysregulated or when teachers and educators are dysregulated. But let's shift now to think about what does it look like when there is a secure relationship from a child's nervous system perspective of what does that look like? And not just the big moments, right? Those small
Mm.
moments, that everyday instruction. Kylie, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I think, you and Diane both named it so beautifully. One really important strategy is just being willing to talk about, name, and identify what's happening, even if it's happening with you. And if we think about relationships in our lives that are close for us, the people we call when we have a bad day, the people who, when we're around them, they help build us up. We feel better in their presence. Those are people who, you have some emotional vulnerability with. You feel safe talking about what's bothering you. You feel safe talking about your feelings. And so, like you just said, Marjorie, about naming what's happening, that's a really big component of creating a safe, relationship oriented classroom and building relationships with students. It's also just simple things that we can take for granted over time and then lose track of in our practice, particularly as, days get hectic. I I mean, the amount that we ask of a teacher in a day is outrageous. And the amount of demands and the amount that has to be accomplished, it's really easy to lose track of or lose sight of those little tiny moments in the day that are like stacking the bricks, making the foundation of the strong relationship. So things like that we talk about are a warm greeting. When you say a child's name in a warm tone of voice, there's a whole body of research that talks about how when people hear their names said in a kind way, it triggers greater activity in the parts of the brain responsible for social behavior, long term memory,
Mm.
auditory and visual processing. So like if you need an education reason to say a child's name in a sweet tone of voice, you've got one. Um, Paying attention to how often you get down on a child's eye level. I know this is something that we've talked about during webinars and in PD sessions in the past. But that's also a practice that it's really easy when we're quickly moving through our day. We're not thinking about it. We're up here and children are down here. Just paying attention to how often you're bringing your body down to be in position with theirs, and to remember that eye level is not the same as eye contact. Diane talked a little bit about how children who are hypervigilant are on high alert for cues of danger. Eye contact can be one of those cues for them. So just pay
Mhm.
attention to your students' sensitivities on that. But coming down to eye level, being on the same level as the person you're communicating with is a very relationship building practice. Nurturing touch, I mentioned it in my opening teacher story. It doesn't have to be big bear hugs. That may not be who
Yeah.
you are as a person, but it can be high fives and handshakes. And I've seen in teachers' classrooms where they have little secret handshakes with students that are individual to each child. Placing a hand on a shoulder, um, you know, uh, being close to a child when you're sitting down to read a book. That closeness can create a sense of safety in our bodies. Again, lots of good research about how that turns on parts of our brain that help support our learning in a classroom. Again, something to pay attention to. Some children are uncomfortable with physical
Mhm.
closeness or physical distance. So, paying attention and noting which children like to be close and which children are uncomfortable with that. And then slowly over time, building a relationship with them so that you can get to a place where closeness doesn't feel scary to them. Um, Noticing their effort in the
Man.
classroom, right? I think that that's something that it's easy sometimes, and especially for certain students, to pay attention to challenging or negative situations, but noticing moments of calm, noticing those moments of peace, paying attention to the effort that they're putting
Yeah.
into a task. And then I keep saying, do this and now also pay attention to this. We also need to pay attention to, and Diane and I talk about this quite a bit, is, there are some children who love to be noticed. They are children who are used to getting praise and they're used to being the shining star and getting positive strokes. And then there are other children who being noticed means that trouble's around the corner, that
Mhm.
being noticed means that you've done something wrong or you're about to be on the receiving end of an adult's anger, shame, embarrassment, resentment. Um, so pay attention to that as well. You can be very well meaning, have all the best intentions, and you're trying to give, a positive affirmation to a child, give some positive noticing attention, and a child reacts negatively to that. That's a really good sign that in their life, they have learned that being noticed is a bad thing and not a good thing. So, again, back up your practice a little bit. Start with the saying their name sweetly, maybe giving a little smile from across the classroom, being a little bit slower in that relationship building process. And eventually, they will come to trust that you're noticing attention is safe and that this classroom is a safe place for me to be able to come off of high alert and get into that regulated state.
That's just so well said and so important. And as we're sharing those strategies, as you mentioned, yes, it needs to be adjusted dependent on the child in front of you. And if we just come back to where we started in the beginning of, right? Every child is going to receive an interaction or an attempt of calm in a different way. And so we just need to recognize that it's about their nervous system. It's not about
Yes.
I don't want this effort or I don't want this recognition. It comes back to their response, and then we just keep we just keep trying to eventually create that safe environment. One of the things that we know can create quite it trauma for children,
Yeah.
a lot of stress for children is literacy and reading, writing. But as we think about that, Diane, do you want to just share a little bit more of like why reading in particular can intensify stress greatly for some students?
Absolutely. And I think it starts with having an audience. So a lot of work that we're doing, we
Mhm.
do independently, or we maybe do part of it with the whole class, and then most of it we're doing on our own, practicing whatever it was we just learned. But with reading, whether it's an audience of one with the teacher, audience of a small group of 4 or 5 kids, or audience of the entire classroom of 20 to 30 plus students, there are people watching you. There are people judging you. So, in addition to their own judgment, they're now concerned, what are other people going to think about me based upon the skills that I have in reading? So that reminds me of one particular student we have that's very aware of how much more skilled his classmates are in reading than he is.
Yeah.
And so reading, even just knowing that that period is coming up, is extremely anxiety provoking for him, because he knows that the second he tries to read anything, it's not going to be as good as all of his classmates. And for a lot of our students, that shame and embarrassment is so overwhelming that they would rather create a giant disruption and throw things across the room and be seen as the bad kid, because that feels less shaming to them than being the kid who struggles to read. So there's a lot of judgment, worried about judgment of others and judgment of self, that comes into play with reading.
Yeah.
Gosh, Diane, as you talk, it just it reminds me so much of children who I've taught. And I'm sure that that's happening for folks listening and watching right now.
Absolutely. I think it's in every classroom, right? And I love the way you shared, Diane, of reading really being this thing that's out there and in the open, and it's something that creates that anxiety. Kylie, will you just talk a little bit more about that importance of preparing our children to be ready to learn? Because again, we know
Yeah.
literacy is that path to equity, is the path, right? It is a critical component of living a life
Hmm.
where we have access and we have equity.
Yes,
But
and
so
choices.
often, and so in the conversation of literacy is important, right? We need to be able to teach it that. And, when I was listening to you, Diane, I was like, well, sometimes that happens because some students learn to read without any instruction and other students don't. And they're like wondering, what's wrong with me? Why don't I get it? But at the same time, it doesn't matter how great that literacy instruction is if our students are not ready to learn.
Yes. Yes, and that's something we've been thinking about and talking a lot about over the last year here at Hegarty. And again, for those of you who've heard us talk about this before, we at Hegarty talk about you can't teach a child to read who's hiding under the table. You also can't teach a child to read whose head is down on their desk and they're disengaged, or who crumbles up their paper and throws it across the room, or who would rather knock over a chair and get sent out of the classroom than be in their instruction. So a huge component, and the main thing we've been talking about so far today, is a a trusting, nurturing relationship with an adult so that the child has the opportunity to co regulate, so that
Mhm.
they feel safe in the classroom, so that they learn that this is a place where I'm allowed to express my feelings, where my teacher expresses their feelings, that this is a safe place for me to make mistakes, that everyone makes mistakes, right? So the relationship is the a number one most important thing that you can do. We always try to help teachers lean into the taking the time at the beginning of the year to build a classroom community, because if you have that community in place and you have individual relationships with students and you understand what their dysregulation looks like and you know your own, right, you'll have this foundation that you can build
True.
off of. Then when you're going into instructional time, to pause and take a moment to regulate together. As Diane was talking about, using some of those regulation practices in the classroom, modeling them for students, doing them with students. So at Hegarty, we talk about helping students get learning ready before you're going to sit down for your literacy instruction time together. Do a breathing exercise, do a
Mhm.
movement exercise. Children, I I talk about it very colloquially as like they're still so close to their physiological process, like they're still so new that's why stress has this outsized impact on them. They're still so connected. Their brains and bodies are still so very much interwoven. So if we can do something with them that helps them make that connection between brain and body, like Diane talked about a movement break, we really like to couple movement and the very, very regulating practice of deep breathing together. So, for example, one of the practices that we do in the curriculum is we do a lot of breathing while we move. So,
Wow.
inhaling through our nose and lifting our shoulders, and then doing a heavy exhale, making a ha sound and dropping your shoulders. So, we go, and if you do that, just even as a grown up sitting here and what I hope is a relatively stress free environment, you can't help but start to feel regulated. You
Mhm.
feel very connected, very present. And so, those kinds of practices before you're doing your literacy instructional time can
Mm.
really help to get children's brains and bodies online, ready to learn, and to note when things start to go awry, to come back to some of those. Also, in the curriculum, we do quite a bit, particularly at the kindergarten level, with crossing your midline. Right, crossing your midline has your brain hemispheres communicating with each other, so you can breathe while you touch your right hand to your left knee and vice versa. So again, a little brain body connection. Doing that midline crossing helps to activate the brain. So those kinds of experiences, and then children get into the habit of it, and they
Okay.
get into the practice of, this is something we do. We get ready to learn. We don't just quickly move from one thing to the next, but we take the moment to pause, have this transition opportunity to help settle ourselves and be ready.
It's so important. And you know, I have to say just something that I'm so proud of for what we are calling attention to something that we all know is so critical, but gets lost in a day of busy or sometimes is added on as an extra and doesn't get to fit into the day. And sometimes, when we talk about learning ready or we talk about these regulation strategies, there's this view of, oh no, it's going to slow down our progress. We can't pause. We have to keep going. We have all of this to learn today, right? Like this is what's on my lesson plan. And because again, as you mentioned earlier, Kylie, teachers have so much on them.
Yes.
And then when we think back to what you were talking about, Diane, right, with the regulation that we need as educators, because we can feel stressed out by all that's on our plate. But what we have to recognize is that's actually not weakening our instruction, it's strengthening our instruction, right? It if we're not ready to learn, it doesn't matter what you're saying to me. It doesn't matter how great that book that you have right
I
there.
know.
Doesn't matter. And so we have to weave this into our day as it is who we are. It is a whole connected piece. It's not, oh, over here, this is something else that we do. And so when we think about what that looks like, Diane, in a classroom, again, I'm going to come back to you of thinking about classrooms and stability and the importance of predictable routines. Again, like this is something we kind of mentioned. I remember hearing about an undergrad of like, making sure that we have routines, but do we understand how important those predictable routines are and those rhythms and why that can be so regulating for not just kids, but also for adults?
Absolutely. Predictability is very regulating. So you're watching this video right now, but if we said, nope, you can't watch the rest, you're going to need to fill out this paper, wait until we look and see what you've learned so far, and then you can watch the rest of the video. All of a sudden, your stress level is going up. It was not what you predicted. It was not what you expected. But if this goes the way you expect it to, I can watch this when I want. I can pause when I want. I can come back when I want. That's what you expect. That keeps your stress level low. So everything we put into place for the kids and every element of consistency that we can keep from day to day is already going to reduce their stress level because they know what to expect. They know first I do this breathing and then I read. And then we do a movement break and then we do some math. Just knowing that helps calm their nervous system. It keeps their thinking brain active. Now, we can't predict everything that happens and we can't make
Right.
everything perfect. So sometimes things might come up that might be a change to routine, but as long as we give kids the heads up, remind them of what strategies we can all use together to deal with the stress of there being a change, the less of an impact it's going to have if you plan for it. And over time, if the students know, oh, in this class, even if something's a little different, my teacher makes sure that we all deal with the stress of that
Mhm.
together. That's regulating for them. So every bit of predictability that you can put in place is helping your students be ready and available for learning.
Yeah, that's so important. Kylie, I know you have mentioned, often that learning doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? And I love that because it's just so true and so powerful. And as I was just mentioning, this isn't something, oh yeah, we're gonna throw this in at some point of the day. The relationships aren't an extra. That it's the
Yes.
necessity, it's the vehicle that gets us there. So, we have educators that's listening today, and as we start to wrap up and think through really all of the amazing information that we're sharing, what's one thing that you would hope to empower educators to do after listening today?
Yeah. It. Well, you know me, Marjorie. I can't just leave it at one thing. Can I get two
And I'm like,
things?
big question, big question.
I had one thing in mind, but then listening to Diane talk, she always inspires me to think of new things. Um, I would say two things here. One is, if you've been teaching for a while, you've probably already done this, whether formally or formally. But I call it identifying your button pusher behavior.
Right.
So, as a teacher, we all have something that a child will do that triggers our stress response. It's not the same for each person, it's wildly different for each person, and it often has to do with our own experience as children. What does that for us? So, I would ask for folks who don't know that consciously to really take a little time and reflect on it and identify what it is and create a plan for how you are going to stay regulated when that behavior occurs. Because, as Diane was saying earlier, children are so observant.
Mhm.
And maybe it has something to do with their newness and their closeness to their physiological process. But boy, do they read a room. They read a room so fast, so much better than so many adults I know. Children can pick up on the nuance of the temperature of the room, of the feelings people have, and particularly children who have learned to be on high alert have learned that skill masterfully. So, for us to be conscious of behaviors that trigger us and what is our plan for how, in the moment, we're going to make sure we get as quickly as possible back into our prefrontal cortex. So that's one thing. The other thing that I would suggest is an exercise I used to do in teacher professional development sessions when we'd be focusing on child guidance practices or behaviors that challenge us. Is I'd ask teachers from memory to make a list of all of the children in their classroom. So you're writing down the first name of every child in your classroom. So first of all, that's an exercise in and of itself to
Yeah.
see who you struggle to remember,
Mm.
and who's the first kid you think of. So make that list, then go back and write something personal, about that child next to their name. It's just for you. You're not going to show this to
Mhm.
anybody, but write down something personal about that child. And when you are going through this exercise, you'll note 400 things about Thomas and nothing about Kimberly. Um, and I think that that's something that can help us just pause and go, oh, huh, I'm gonna spend a little bit more time learning about what's going on in Kimberly's life. It allows you as like an indicator of where do I need to focus my attention on building relationship. You might also find that it's really easy to make a list of things that you love about Rohan. And the only things you can think about
Mhm.
Annalee are the challenging things, right? So that's another cue of, gosh, I'm going to put a little bit more time, energy, and attention into making sure my relationship with those students is really solid.
I absolutely love that. I hope we have some, educators listening today that are going to try that I mean, I think that's absolutely amazing. Um, Diane, is there anything that you would like to share as a thinking about a shift you would hope educators could make after listening?
I think just going back to where we started is giving yourself permission to take care of you. Figure out what works for you and then figure out a way to bring that into the routine of your classroom. There's certain things we have to do, certain things we have to teach, but there's also a lot of freedom in little things that you can incorporate in how you structure your room. So think about what's going to keep me the most regulated because if I'm regulated, that gives me my best chance of keeping my classroom regulated.
I absolutely love that, and so important, and as you said, not done. We see it as, doing for us rather than recognizing it's so critical, to be the best we can be for children. I just wanna thank you both, Kylie and Diane, for sharing your wealth of knowledge on such an important topic. I wanna thank the educators that are listening for doing some of the hardest and most important work and showing up for children every day in so many ways. And I hope if you walk away today with one thing is just that reminder that these secure relationships, the stable environments that our students have to have are exactly that. They are critical. It's not a bonus. It's not, something extra. It is the foundation on which everything else is built. And we will continue this conversation. We are committed to this work and we are so excited that you showed up today to again, thank you so much to learn from Kylie and Diane.
Thank you for having me, Marjorie. This is great.
Diane, thank you so much for being here.
It was my pleasure, and I hope this is helpful for the teachers who are watching.